Few authors have contributed to the horror world more than HP Lovecraft. It's a name that has become synonymous with a very specific type of fiction, Lovecraftian. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through all of the films that are adaptations of H.P. Lovecraft works. Now, I'm going to skip the movies that are like just based on Lovecraft in general and films that are Lovecraftian. So don't put in the comments that I missed In the Mouth of Madness because it's not based on a specific Lovecraft book and instead just embodies that Lovecraft vibe. So all of the things that you're going to see in this following video have a specific H.P. Lovecraft work that they are attempting to adapt. Perhaps the earliest direct adaptation of one of Lovecraft's works was in 1963, and it's The Haunted Palace from the recently passed king of low-budget cinema, Roger Corman. Oddly enough, this was billed as an adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe and does use a touch of his work, but the bulk of the film was based on the 1927 novella, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. The Poe connection wasn't Corman's idea, and it was the distributor, AIP, that chose to market it that way, as there had been a number of successful Poe adaptations in that time period. Against Corman's wishes, they changed the title and added Price reading a pair of Poe quotes in order to make it happen. It marks the very first on-screen mention of the Necronomicon, Cthulhu, and Yog-Sothoth, and even though there would be shorts and international films that may have brought them up earlier, this was the first big-time introduction of them to a mass audience. It featured Vincent Price and Lon Chaney Jr. That one would be followed up just 2 years later, in 1965, with the film Die, Monster, Die, which was also called Monster of Terror and The House at the End of the World, which is pretty awesome title, but hey, so is Die Monster Die. This one is a somewhat loose version of the 1927 short story, The Color Out of Space. And make sure you pronounce that U in the color there. It's color, not color. Hear the difference? This was directed by Daniel Haller and was his first directing gig, although he had worked behind the scenes on Corman's House of Usher and Pit and the Pendulum. It would star Boris Karloff in one of his later roles shortly before his death in 1969. Whereas the original film took place on a rural farm, this one switches the action to a more elaborate Gothic castle. And yeah, I mean, if you're looking for an accurate representation of the source material, you're going to have to check back on one of the later versions. The next entry occurred in 1968, and it was also a pretty high-profile affair with The Crimson Altar. Even though it's not credited anywhere in the marketing, this one is based on Dreams in the Witch House, a short story from 1933 that first ran in an issue of Weird Tales. It was directed by Vernon Sewell and would be his second-to-last film, but he'd been in the industry since the 1930s. It had a massive all-star cast with Michael Gough, Rupert Davies, Barbara Steele, Christopher Lee, and Boris freaking Karloff. This was right at the ending of his career. He was over 80 years old and not in the best health, and this would be one of his last roles. The reviews weren't terrible, but they also weren't that kind, saying that it wasn't a worthy film for one of Karloff's last gigs. There was a 2-year gap before our next one, and that was in 1970 with The Dunwich Horror. This then officially becomes the first time that a film had the same title as the Lovecraft work that it was adapting. It was a version of a short story from 1928 that first ran in a magazine called Weird Tales, although it took great liberties with the narratives. Like a couple before it, this was also from Roger Corman's Alta Vista Productions and would again be directed by Daniel Haller and would also star Dean Stockwell and Sandra Dee playing against type in a horror film. It would include some key lore as it had the Necronomicon in it, as well as discussion of the old ones. It got torn apart by critics, though, with a lot of the criticism for Dee's performance and its lack of Lovecraftian tone. Well, it's hard to believe that there was a solid 15-year gap before they tried to bring HP to the big screen once more, but in 1985, we get a big one with Re-Animator. This one was directed by Stuart Gordon and was shot for a meager budget of around $1 million. It was based on a series of stories from 1921 and 22 called Herbert West Re-Animator and ran in Home Brew magazine. It originally ran for 6 episodes, and Lovecraft hated the stories and was only paid $5 for each one.
It said that he didn't care for having to end each chapter with a cliffhanger and then be forced to do a recap at the beginning of the next one. The movie would use a number of elements from the stories, but clearly updated things into modern times as the stories were set against World War I. The character of Hill, carrying his head, was one of the direct carryovers, although in the stories he was a military major that West served under with a different name. It was a decent, although unremarkable success at the box office, but became a massive hit on the home market, creating an entire franchise and one of horror's most recognizable characters in Herbert West. The success of Re-Animator made Lovecraft a whole thing, and Gordon returned to the well 1 year later in 1986 for another adaptation with From Beyond. This would bring back a number of players from the previous film, including Jeffrey Combs and Barbara Crampton, but also brought in Ken Foray. It was based on a tale from 1920, but didn't get published until a full 14 years later in 1934, where it ran in a publication called The Fantasy Fan. The story itself is very short, and when the film was made, it required quite a bit of elaboration, and in fact, the actual tale is only the opening sequence of the movie. The budget was increased quite a bit from Re-Animator and ended up costing $4.5 million, but producer Brian Yuzna said that they ran out of money before all of the effects for the film's finale were complete. Even though it got solid reviews, it didn't perform at the box office, only scaring up around $1.5 million back. It got a sort of sequel in 2021 with the series The Resonator, Miskatonic U from Full Moon, and we'll discuss that a little bit later. 1 year later, we got our first case of a second adaptation with The Curse, which was also known as The Farm. Like Die Monster Die, this was also based on Color Out of Space, and again, note that U sound as it was a somewhat more accurate take on the original story. This one was from David Keith, the actor, making his directorial debut, and starred Will Wheaton and Claude Akins, and a small role for Duke Boy John Schneider. It's a pretty notorious film because Wheaton later on said that the set was crazy and that the cast members were in danger and abused frequently, and that child labor laws were constantly broken. It actually had a nice sized budget of $4 million, almost that of From Beyond, and also turned out to be a bomb, only earning around $2 million back. Regardless of that, it went on to spawn several sequels, although none of them are connected to this one in any way, nor are they a part of any Lovecraft mythology. After another year, there was another entry, sort of, with 1988's Pulse Pounders. This was from Empire Pictures, the precursor to Full Moon, and it was meant to be an anthology film with 3 segments. One was a sequel to Dungeon Master, and the second was a follow-up to Trancers, but the third was called The Evil Clergyman. It was an adaptation of an excerpt of a letter that Lovecraft had written back in 1933. He wrote a story to a friend named Bernard, and part of it was a dream that the author had, and after his death, the letter was run in an issue of Weird Tales magazine. Charles Band directed the segments, and Evil Clergyman would bring back Crampton and Coombs, and also Re-Animator's David Gale. Unfortunately, Empire Pictures collapsed, and the film's release was canceled. Decades later, in 2011, a work print would be found and digitally restored, screening for the public for the first time. In that same year, there was another entry, one that went straight to video, with The Unnameable. This one is based on a short story of that same name that was first published back in 1925 in an issue of Weird Tales, and features a character simply named Carter that may or may not have been the reoccurring Lovecraft character Randolph Carter. The film version makes that more concrete by fully naming the character and clearly takes a lot of liberties with the tale to stretch it out into feature length. It was the directorial debut of Jean-Paul Ouliette and skipped the theaters and went straight to video. It was available in both R-rated and unrated versions and was a minor cult success. 1 year later, in 1989, we have one that was a bit under the radar with Beyond Dream's Door. This was a very loose adaptation of The Shadow Out of Time, which was first published back in 1936 in an issue of Astounding Stories. It was by Jay Wolfel, who both wrote and directed it, and it was a redo of a short film that he had done as a student project. The film really only takes the bare bones of the original story and has not much in common in the end. The original story focuses on creatures that are able to transfer their minds into ours and inhabit our bodies, and dreams being a sort of a layer of reality in between our two worlds. And the film drops that whole aspect to mainly just be about a monster. It had a really low budget of around 60 grand and was mostly acted by members of a local community theater group and friends of the director. It went straight to video, getting a moderate release, and actually got some really nice reviews, and has since developed a decent cult following. The next year, another entry came around, and it's 1990's Bride of Re-Animator. Now, usually when I do this sort of thing, I don't include a sequel unless it was adapting a work itself, and in this case, it is. In fact, I'd say that there's more of the original Herbert West Re-Animator stories present in this sequel than there is in the original film. Brian Yuzna, who produced the first Re-Animator, stepped in here to direct this one, and most of the cast returned, with the exception of Barbara Crampton. They did shoot a bit that picked up right where the first one left off, with Meg coming back and recast the character, but when the effect didn't really work all that well, they cut it from the film. It was budgeted at around $2.5 million, and although the first film had a theatrical run, this one did not, and went straight to video. The reviews weren't great, and it was considered a step down from the first one, but still developed a strong cult following and did quite well on the rental market. We get a wild one in 1991 with the release of a film with many titles, but was mostly known as The Resurrected, but was also out there as Scatterbrain and The Ancestor. This one was a version of the novella The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, and had an interesting publication history. It was written in 1927, but wasn't published while the author was alive, taking until 1941 to show up in an issue of Weird Tales, but only in an abridged form. The first full release wasn't until 1943, where it was printed in a collection called Wall of Sleep. The film version was directed by Dan O'Bannon and starred Chris Sarandon as Charles Dexter Ward, and was originally meant for a theatrical release, but after a series of screenings at various festivals, it was instead released direct to video. Only 1 year passed before we got another one, but in 1992 there was another sequel with The Unnameable 2, The Statement of Randolph Carter. As you can tell from the title, this one steps away from the adaptation of The Unnameable and covers another Lovecraft tale with The Statement of Randolph Carter, a short story that was published in 1920 in a magazine called The Vagrant. It is a very short story. It amounts to only a portion of the screen time of the film version, although the sections that adapt it is somewhat accurate. The rest of the film picks up from the events of the first one, bringing back the surviving characters and featuring Julie Strain taking on the role of the creatures. It also had new characters played by the great David Warner and John Rhys Davies. Like the first film, it went straight to video and didn't get quite the attention and appreciation that one did. 93 gave us a big one because it wore its inspiration on its sleeve with Necronomicon, which was also called HP Lovecraft's Necronomicon, and even Necronomicon Book of the Dead. This one was an anthology film with 3 segments featuring 3 directors. Bride of Re-Animator's Brian Yuzna did a wraparound story involving Lovecraft himself, played by Jeffrey Combs, in an original story in which he's seeking out the title book. Yuzna also did a segment called Whispers, which was based on The Whisperer in the Darkness, a novella from 1930 that was first published in Weird Tales. Another segment was by Christoph Gans, director of Brotherhood of the Wolf and Silent Hill, and was called The Drowned. It was the loosest adaptation of The Crew and was very loosely based on The Rats in the Walls, a short story from 1923 that also first showed up in Weird Tales. The third segment was called Cold and was by Shusuke Kaneko, who would later do the amazing Gamera trilogy from the 1990s, the Guardian of the Universe saga. His section was based on Cool Air, a short story from 1928 that showed up in an issue of Tales of Magic and Mystery, and his segment would be the most faithful to the source material. Even though the film was completed in 93 and had some small screenings, it then sat on a shelf until getting released on video in 96. 94 gave us one film, since in that year we had the release of Lurking Fear. This was an adaptation of a story of that same name from 1923, which first ran in an issue of a magazine called Homebrew, the same one in which Re-Animator first ran. The film version was released under the umbrella of Full Moon Entertainment, produced by Charles Band, and was both written and directed by C. Courtney Joyner, who had a long history of working with Full Moon. This one is also mostly an adaptation in name only, since the plot can only be described as loosely based on the original story and makes a large number of changes. It was released direct to video, like most Full Moon projects, and was mostly given negative reviews. Speaking of loosely based, in '95 there was another one from Full Moon with Castle Freak. This was the return of Stuart Gordon to the world of HP and was a riff on a short story from 1926 called The Outsider that was published in an issue of Weird Tales. The film had to do a lot of elaboration though, since the story was extremely short and featured a different sort of main character. Gordon brought back Jeffrey Combs and Barbara Crampton and dropped the over-the-top and somewhat campy nature of his previous Lovecraft tales, resulting in a unique entry. However, this was during an era where Full Moon was starting to struggle, and their films weren't performing as they once were, and they were unable to market it as strongly as they did some others, and it was a little bit lost in the market. It was a little better reviewed, although maybe not as well as Re-Animator or From Beyond was, but people liked the darker tone and bleaker atmosphere, and has now gained a good-sized cult appreciation. 2 years later, in '97, there was another film with multiple titles. In most places, it was known as Bleeders, but in others, it went by Hemoglobin. Much like Lurking Fear, this was also based on The Lurking Fear, but again, it's loosely adapted. This one was directed by Peter Savatek, and even though he had done some genre work before this, it seems like where he jumped off the train, since there's no horror or sci-fi in his roster after this. The bigger deal is that the script was co-written by legendary writer Dan O'Bannon of Alien and Return of the Living Dead fame, and would end up being his final original script that he wrote. It was released direct to video and didn't get much fanfare or decent reviews, but there's no way to not remember this one due to the cool VHS packaging it had, where there was a plastic cover over the front with a raised relief and a red liquid underneath to look like blood. '99 gave us a shorter one with a low-budget adaptation of Cool Air called Cool Air. The story was originally ran in Tales of Magic and Mystery back in 1928, and this version was a 50-minute black and white creation shot for a shoestring. The director is a man named Brian Moore, who also appears in the film as Randolph Carter, and is actually mostly accurate to the original tale with some minor tweaks. It would end up being the kickoff to a series of adaptations called the HP Lovecraft Collection, which is meant to showcase films that were submitted to the HP Lovecraft Film Festival. A curious one arrived in 2000 with the release of Cthulhu. It was based on 2 different stories, taking parts of each and mixing them into one narrative. Parts of it are based on The Thing in the Doorstep, a short tale that was published in Weird Tales back in 1937, and the other parts take from The Shadow over Innsmouth, a novella from 1931. This was from Australia and written and directed by Damien Heffernan, and was also done on a very low budget. It's modernized, so elements of either story are brought into the present day, and there's a good amount of alterations done to either tale, but it had a hard time getting distributed and only ended up getting a DVD release 2 years after being completed. 2001 gave us a bit of a bigger one with the release of Dagon. This also takes inspiration from 2 separate stories, and one of them is Shadow over Innsmouth again. The other is called Dagon, a short story from 1919 that saw print in an issue of The Vagrant and was then republished in Weird Tales. It's yet another one from Stuart Gordon and was a part of his whole deal where he produced and made a series of films in Spain using a mostly Spanish cast and crew. It got a theatrical run over there and did okay, and then had a straight-to-video release here in the US, where it got so-so reviews, but eventually earned a good-sized following amongst Lovecraft fans and horror fans in general. This next one is probably the least worthy of being on here, since it's 2003's Beyond Re-Animator, and I'm not saying that because of the film's quality or anything, it's because it's not really based on the actual stories anymore. There's still trace elements to draw from the original Herbert stories, though, and things that build upon them, so I figured I'd include it. It was once again headed up by Brian Yuzna, returning him to the franchise after Bride of Re-Animator. Like Gordon's film, this was also done in collaboration with Spanish company Filmax, and was also done with a mostly Espanol cast and crew. The budget was still low at $3 million, and several different script concepts were gone through before ending up on Herbert West in prison. It wasn't as warmly received as its predecessors, though, and also went straight to video, becoming the end of the series, even though several follow-ups were attempted. '05 gave us one of the most faithful, albeit brief, adaptations with The Call of Cthulhu. This was a short film of 47 minutes, made to look like a classic film in black and white and done silent with intertitles. It was based on The Call of Cthulhu, a short story from 1928 that first appeared in yet another issue of Weird Tales, one of the most popular places for Lovecraft's stories, and even though the original tale was frequently called unfilmable, making it a silent film worked in its favor, and it would end up getting a ton of attention for being extremely faithful to the source material and being very well done on such a tiny budget. There was a 2-year gap before the next arrival, and it was 2007's Chill. This was also based on Cool Air and takes quite a few plot points from it, but also differs pretty strongly, since it also incorporates a story about a serial killer that preys on prostitutes. This was by Serge Radnunski, who did a string of straight-to-video low-budget B-movies during this era. The story ties into other Lovecraft tales since it talks about the Necronomicon, although the marketing for the film didn't feature any references to HP at all, nor does it discuss its source inspiration. It did go straight to video, getting mostly negative reviews. In that same year, there was another low-budget number that was just also titled Cthulhu. Like the other film with that name, this was also more of a take on Shadow over Innsmouth and is set up in the Pacific Northwest, moving it away from Lovecraft's beloved New England settings. It was from director Daniel Gildark and explores the story through an LGBT lens, bringing a new interpretation to the tale, although it actually received a number of really nice write-ups and had a very small theatrical run of only a handful of theaters before being available on the home market. In 2008, there was another go at the Dunwich Horror, this one a TV movie. It featured a return of Dean Stockwell, playing a different character here than he did in the original, and the cast also featured Jeffrey Combs, given top billing, even if his role isn't quite as big as you'd expect. This one was both written and directed by Lee Scott, director of the mega blockbuster hit Transmorphers. And yeah, his movies were mostly Asylum-style knockoffs, but this sort of feels like the same and was not quite as highly regarded as the original, but did stay true enough to the storyline. 3 years later, the team that brought you The Call of Cthulhu went back to the well with 2011's The Whisperer in Darkness. This one was based on the story of that name from 1931 that also was in Weird Tales and was a little longer since it was a novella. Like their earlier film, this one was done in a classic style, though instead of being done like a silent film, this had a 30s aesthetic going on. It was never released theatrically, but did a tour of various festivals and was later put out on DVD. It was also very acclaimed and praised for its accuracy to the source material. There's a smaller gap now because the next one didn't arrive until 2013, and it's the Banshee chapter. This is one that is more of what you'd call Lovecraftian as opposed to being directly adapting his stories, although there is a portion that is loosely based on From Beyond, which sets the plot into motion. It was a directorial debut from Blair Erickson, although it would end up being their only film as well. Outside of HP, it also brings up elements of actual government testing of hallucinogenic drugs in the past and was shot on a low budget with a limited time frame. It would go straight to video, but actually received mostly nice reviews and has since become a minor cult classic. This one's a little on the wacky side because in 2017 there was a release of Re-Animator, Revenge of the Parody. It was billed as a spoof of the Re-Animator and features similar storylines and themes, also taking inspiration from the original story, but moves them into an extremely unique way. This is more of a subversive underground film than a parody or an adaptation, and was by Dylan Mars Greenberg, notorious director of Amityville Vanishing Point, and they've done extensive work with Trauma over the years. This didn't get much of a release, but is available on video or streaming, and is pretty bizarre and fun. There's another 2-year gap until 2019's arrival of another version of Color Out of Space, the third to show up on this list, and yet the only one to have the actual title attached to it, even if it is missing the U. This one was handled by notorious director Richard Stanley, whose troubles during The Island of Dr. Moreau have become the stuff of legend. This also has Nick Cage Jolie Richardson and Tommy Chong in it and follows the story's plot somewhat close, but also adds some flourishes of its own, and is a visual treat. It got a limited release in the US, playing in a mere 81 theaters, and earned a bit there, pulling in $1 million, but its main focus was release on streaming, where it would get quite a bit of attention and a number of glowing reviews. 1 year later, there was another shot at one that's getting a lot of play here since it's 2020's The Deep Ones. This is another go at the shadow over Innsmouth, and was also titled HP Lovecraft's The Deep Ones. Or I guess someplace called it HP Lovecraft Was a Deep One? This was both written and directed by Chad Farron, who's racked up a number of genre credits, including Easter Bunny Kill Kill, Someone's Knocking at the Door, and Exorcism at 60,000 Feet. Again, it brings the story into the modern day, and there's a number of liberties taken with the plotline, but the core premise remains the same. It played in a few film festivals across the US and even had a very small theatrical run, but just never gained much more attention to get cult status. Also in 2020 was a remake of Castle Freak, but also a different take on it since it would also incorporate elements of the Dunwich Horror in it. It was headed up by Tate Steinsiek, mostly known for being a special effects guy and a competitor on the first season of Face Off. Barbara Crampton would return, although she's a different character in this one, and there were intentions for a bigger rollout, but due to the onset of COVID, it was held off and then released directly onto streaming. It's notable for ending on a bit of a cliffhanger, but also introducing Herbert West in the very last scene, setting up a sequel as yet that has not happened. Here's one I originally wasn't going to include because it's billed as a TV series, but it was also released as a series of movies, and it's 2021's The Re-Animator. This was again from Full Moon, and was done as a 6-episode TV series, which was then collected into a single film, running 3 hours long. This is sort of a mashup of various Lovecraft properties, but the main one is From Beyond, although the later episodes feature more involvement from Herbert West and the Reagent. It was directed by William Butler, former actor turned director, and he'd done quite a bit of work for Full Moon around this time, and continues to, handling this series as well as a number of Demonic Toys related films. Almost at current times now, and in 2022, there was one called Venus from Spain. This is another version of the Dreams in the Witch House, and is probably one of the more obscure ones on here. It was by Jaime Balaguero, director of the Rex series, so it's got a great creator behind it, and again, has to be said that it's very loosely based on the original concept. This was mostly done for the Spanish market, and has played theatrically there, but did get a small distribution in the US as well. 2023 gave us a higher profile one because we had the release of Suitable Flesh, and this one was again based on The Thing on the Doorstep. It featured Barbara Crampton, who was really the MVP of Lovecraft adaptations, but also had Heather Graham and Bruce Davison in it. It was directed by Joe Lynch, who had previously directed Wrong Turn 2 and Mayhem, and did a healthy run of the festival circuit before hitting the streaming services. The reviews were quite favorable, and it seemed to get a nice amount of attention, and again, takes the core concept of an original story and then builds upon it.
So there you have it, the entire history of HP Lovecraft adaptations. Let me know which ones I've missed down below. I'm sure there's some that are direct to the internet that I might have possibly missed. I'm not quite sure. I skipped all of the ones that are sort of just a general Lovecraft, like clearly I said In the Mouth of Madness, or things like Call Girl of Cthulhu, which are very fun and dip into Lovecraft's world, but aren't based on a specific work of his. But tell me the ones down below, and I believe I would like to do a video in the near future on films that are Lovecraftian as opposed to adapting Lovecraft. But let me know what you thought of this down below in the comments. Let me know if you enjoyed this video by hitting that like button. Also, if you enjoy the channel, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell to get notified when new videos are up. Also, if you get a chance, check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines, where you can help support this channel like these guys over here do. I appreciate them for helping out, and I appreciate you guys just for coming and watching the video. And I will see you very shortly for another great one. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.